on this computer. Okay, well, welcome everybody, either in person or watching later on. And thank you very much for coming to join us for our session tonight. We're really excited for this one because we've got Melanie Back-Hansen with us. And as most of you will know, Melanie is at least partly responsible for the House Through Time book and the tie-in with the television series that I think we've all been glued to when it was on earlier in the year. And Mel's going to talk to us a bit about tracing history of houses. So for those of us who are looking to do some house histories as part of our one place study, this is going to be absolutely ideal. So I'm going to mute everybody and then try and remember to unmute Melanie because it works better that way. Right, we should be able to hear Melanie, and then I have to remember to mute myself in a minute. So I think over to you, Melanie. You can take it away.
Okay, great. I was saying to Janet, actually, it's quite funny because normally I'd be standing in front of a PowerPoint screen and have cards in my hand and, you know, pointing at images. So this is a little bit different, but essentially, I'm going to cover a lot of the key sources, which I imagine many of you are probably familiar with, at least some of them, because the crossover between house history and local history, and certainly what you do with one place studies, there's a lot of parallel, there's a lot of similarities. So, and especially when you think of a house in its context, you know, actually a house doesn't sit in isolation. It is very much attached to its street and its village and its town. And so when looking at the history of a house, that comes into it. If I jump straight in, just to remember that every house is different, and actually, again, you know, with you covering the history of areas in completely different parts of the country and different countries, you know, every source will perhaps differ. There might be some dates available for some areas and not for others, and this is always, you know, part of the fun when researching the history of a house. So, you know, you come to it with what you're given, and some houses you can find a full collection of deeds which tell you the complete history of a house, you know, and a whole gamut of details, where other houses will have far fewer documents and you're sort of scratching to find all the bits and pieces, but that's how it is, and every location will be different. But as it happens, the local history is actually vital, and that's actually where I would always start. A lot of these things will be very familiar to you, but looking at the house in its context, in what parish it's part of, what ward is it a part of, what was the manorial history, what was the estate history, you know, who was the lord of the manor, who were the prominent landowners in that area, how did it change? And they're all really key, not only for piecing together the history of the house in its context, but also to guide you onto where sources are held. So certain sources will be catalogued by their parish. And again, you probably have, you know this from your own work. So if you know, you come to a house and then you gauge, you know, all those different bits and pieces, and that will help you along the journey as you work out where different sources are held. And even things like county boundaries. You know, I had a house which is currently in Gloucestershire, but actually it was originally in Worcestershire, and then the estate collection documents were actually in Birmingham. So, you know, like you just got, if you piece together the different elements to make sure you know where to look in order to find the right documents. But also local history is important for the context with the house. So it might give you clues as to why the house was built. You know, was it a purely agricultural area, and did it develop just naturally around a big manor house, and you know, it was generations of labourers, or perhaps it was a fishing village or a mining town, and then how things changed. So was it affected by the canals or the railways, or perhaps it was impacted by war, and that could be the First and Second World War, or it could be the Civil War, you know. So actually having a bit of knowledge about the impact in the area, and as I say, it will guide you into clues about why a house was built, and then perhaps changes that occurred. You know, obviously if if it suffered heavily from bombing during the Second World War, then that can provide a lot of clues about changes in different documents and things. So having all that context about the local history is really important. And yeah, just to say also, before I start delving through the specific documents, the differences with owners versus occupiers. And again, you may have come across this, but obviously some sources will give you details about who the owners were, but that might not necessarily tell you who was actually living in the house. And there's different documents for both. They cross over, you know, some deeds will give you the owner, but also tell you that it's been occupied by, you know, Tom Smith since such and such, or, you know, so you can find clues in both, but there will be differences. And equally in occupational records, you literally, who's paying the rates or who's actually living in the house, who's registered in the house, they're less likely to have actually owned the house. So, and also to remember that prior to the First World War, actually it was only about 10 to 12%. There's some disparity with some of the statistics, but around 10% of people owned their own home. So you've got 90% of the population who didn't actually own their own home. Most people rented. So it just helps to have an understanding of that when you're looking at the records. So before I delve into the different sources, there's a few top tips. Work backwards is my big shout out top tip, especially with older houses. But the same would apply if it was, you know, a house built in 1910. You know, actually, if you work back from details you're certain of now, and then you're tracing it back through the records, and it's easier to spot where changes occur, particularly house numbers and house names. Because you can, even when you're looking at perhaps a census online, and you delve into the 1881 census and you find, you know, number 10 Station Road, but actually now it's a different house number, and even the street name might have changed. So you can get really confused if you delve back too far without having the details that follow. So yeah, work backwards is my key thing. Yeah, name and number changes, and then just taking it step by step, not to sort of jump too quickly. But when you're starting with a house history, obviously it helps to perhaps look at the architectural features, if there are any. I mean, it's a bit tricky. Obviously, I'm not an architectural historian, I'm a social historian. But it obviously helps to have a glimpse at what's still around and whether there are still some features that are retained. And it might be that the interior of the house is just completely different. You know, room layouts have changed. I know original features like ceiling roses have all gone. You know, it happens. You know, but perhaps just step outside and look at it briefly. You know, even just look at what type of bricks are they, what color bricks, what size bricks. Perhaps the type of windows. Are they sash windows? Are they crittle windows? Are they large bay windows, or is it smaller casement windows? And so things like that will give you at least a few clues. And there's lots of sources you can, even online, but obviously in the local libraries and archives, you can find some key books that give you a few hints about key features of different periods. So whether it's Georgian or it's an interwar house or that sort of thing. But it helps to have just a little understanding of perhaps some architectural features. And then my big thing is maps. So once I've actually looked at the local history and got an idea, then I will look at maps. And there's all manner of maps. And again, depending on your location, these might differ. But there's some essential ones that are vital. The Ordnance Survey Map is probably the best one to start with. They were produced in detail. There's lots of different versions of the Ordnance Survey Maps, and some of them, the early ones, are not detailed enough. They were much broader. And so in terms of finding properties and looking at individual houses, they started to produce more detailed maps roughly from the 1860s and 70s. But again, it depends. In some areas, they might not appear for the first time until the 1880s. So it just depends. But then they periodically updated them. So, for example, if you had one in the 1870s, then you might have an updated version in the 1890s, and then another one in the 1910s, and then another one in the 1930s. So you can actually trace the development, not only of your house, but the street and the area, and you can see where changes occurred. And equally, actually, you might look at the 1870s map and your house isn't there yet, but then obviously it's there in 1890s or 1910, and then you've got an idea, okay, clearly the street was built 1880s roughly. And so it gives you a few clues as to the period that you're looking at. Then there's all sorts of maps, and these will vary depending on your location. So there's parish maps, county maps. There's also estate and manorial maps. So again, if you knew or know of it's being part of a certain manor or a certain landed estate, then there might be a collection that has a survey or map attached to it, which shows you the property in the past. Then there's things like bomb damage maps. Again, they're largely in the cities, but that's worth investigating. There's also some very unique maps. So there's things that accompany the survey of disease. There was, in the 19th century, there were maps produced for things like the cholera epidemic and typhoid, things like that, which will give you some incredible detail about the area and the house. There's also things like fire insurance maps, the Goad fire insurance maps. They were produced largely in towns, but they were effectively a survey of property in order to work out its risk for fire. And so it actually gives you details of the property, it gives you the dimensions of the property, but it also gives you what it was used for. So again, I tend to use the ones in London, but they cover other towns and cities where they give you even what it is, like I've done some that were, hairdresser or a cafe, or, because it's, the downstairs is a cafe, and obviously it's going to have a higher fire risk, so it's noted down. So things like that will give you some clues about its story and its history. There's some other key maps, which, again, you've probably come across these, but the Tithe Map, and this was produced in the 1840s, roughly. The change in tithe, it was brought in legislation about 1834, but they then produced maps in order to survey property and value it, because tithe payment was changing from in kind or in goods, so your wheat crop or your cattle or whatever it was, and it was changing to a monetary system, so you were going to have to pay a monetary fine or a tax. But the map is wonderful, so it gives you a survey of the location, so you're able to pinpoint the specific house. But then it has an accompanying apportionment, which is effectively its valuation. So it gives you the owner of the house or the property, the occupant, and also a description. So you might find that it's just described as homestead or house, but then you've got all the accompanying fields, meadows, all sorts of pasture things, and then it gives you the dimensions and it gives you the value. So it's a very valuable map, especially in that sort of early Victorian period. It's a really important source. And then the Enclosure Map, equally, this was largely late 18th century, and the availability depends, because obviously different areas perhaps were enclosed at different times. Some were private acts of enclosure, some were public or government. And so it's different times and different details, and some might not have any enclosure at all. Or you might find that you've got an enclosure map, but actually you don't have the tithe map. There's some differences in some areas. But again, the enclosure is great. It gives you details about the property, its location, and then who the landowner was, and then potentially its occupant, and then how things were changing. So it's also a valuable source. Okay, so obviously there's all myriad of maps, as I said. A lot of these are getting better at being online. There's places like the Genealogist, which is doing a lot with the Tithe Map online. There's the Ordnance Survey Maps, are very easily found, but you might not get all of them. So the National Library of Scotland has, the whole of the UK, not just Scotland, they have a lot of the Ordnance Survey maps, but might not have some. So some of the earlier ones aren't on there. But there's equally another site called old-maps.co.uk. And in that one, you can't download the images, you have to actually pay for them, but you can see them online, you can visually, and you can sort of zoom in and out, and you can see most of them from the earliest ones through to the 1990s. So it's actually, you can see quite a lot. There's also some sites like Know Your Place, which is in the southwest of the country, so places like Bristol and Somerset and Gloucestershire, and that's also wonderful. And then there's Layers of London is another one, which has got all manner of maps. That's takes you everything from the Roman period through to now, so that's quite a site. So otherwise, especially some of the more special, some of the smaller parish maps and things, you'd have to go to the archives. So hopefully they've opened up in your area. But yeah, so it just depends. You can do a lot online before you head to the archives, but then perhaps some of the more specific maps, then you still have to view at the archives. As I said earlier, there's slightly different records for occupants and owners, and the key one for ownership is deeds, is deeds. And essentially these are the legal documents attached to the property. So it's a bit of a sore point that they're increasingly disappearing. Basically, there was a change in the law in 1970 where you only had to keep the historic deeds back 15 years. And by this point, a lot of houses were also being registered with land registries. So unfortunately, it meant that a lot of older deeds ended up in the skip, which was, as a historian, it's a bit heartbreaking. But you can still find them. Perhaps your mortgage advisor or solicitor may still have them in a cupboard somewhere, and you can request those or request copies. Equally, if it's not your home, if you're researching a different house, you can request copies. I've done that for clients where I get written permission to get copies of the deeds. Land registry have some details. It's a bit sketchy. You can get the title register, but I found a lot of houses where it only goes back to the 1990s, 1980s, so it's a bit, you can get some details, but they certainly don't go back to sort of 17th century or something. Sometimes you'll be really lucky and they go back to the 19th century. I have a few of those. So land registry, your solicitor, but otherwise they're in archives in old collections. So that could be the manorial collection, estate ownership collection, or family estate. Also in actual old solicitors' collections, you get some that have got literally boxes and boxes of old deeds, and they're all part of an old solicitor's collection. So you can find those. And in essence, they are a variety of different sources. So as I say, it's everything related to the legal ownership of a house. So it could include leases, it could include mortgages, it could include conveyances. And then you also get marriage agreements, and especially when you get back to the 19th century and beyond, when we had different laws in place and different ideas of ownership. Obviously, women didn't necessarily own their own property; it went to their husband. So, there's one example where it was a house in the Cotswolds, and I found a marriage agreement from 1764, and actually, because it was actually part of the arrangement between her family and his family, and obviously all her property was going to be passed on to him. The deeds actually went into detail about the provenance of the ownership of the property. But it was gold dust. It was brilliant, because basically even 1764 was quite early, but it gave the provenance of the property back to 1586. So I was in the archives just going, oh my God, just yay. So, and it was a fantastic story as well. So it ended up, the house was owned by Queen Elizabeth I, and as you do, and she ended up passing it on to her physician at the time, and there was all this drama because he was accused of treason, who ended up being, executed for treason. So, and it all unravelled through these marriage agreements from 1764 about the whole story about what happened in the Elizabethan time. So yeah, you just don't know what you'll find. So they can be brilliant. And actually, it was really fortunate in that case because it also mentioned who the occupant of the house, because it was a farmhouse, and it referenced the family who were occupying the house, which was brilliant because then I could match it with other parish records or other estate records, which gave the details of the family. Ended up being in the same family for hundreds of years because it passed down. So, fantastic details. In some cases, you might not find that, so it can be a bit of a challenge. I'm doing a house at the moment, actually, in Essex, which actually the area, oh gosh, it's so confusing, but actually the area where the house is situated, the house was built in the early 16th century. But the manorial history is really complicated. It was 3 different manors, and it changed hands several times. And at one point, one person owned 2 of the manors, but sold it on at different times. And so, so they're trying to track the manorial history as being quite a drama. But you can unravel it. The only problem is the house I'm researching is a small timber framed farmhouse, and it's not clearly identified in a lot of the records. So there was nothing else to accompany some of the manorial records. So it's a bit of a challenge, that one. But sometimes you can find a whole lot of different details. So you can find surveys and plans, you can find rent books, you can find receipts for rent paid, all sorts of things. So just depends on each manor and each collection. But moving on to the occupational records, and these, there's quite a lot, and how you use them and whether they're relevant will just depend on the property or the house that you're researching. So again, starting from our more recent history and working back, one of the key sources which you've probably all heard about is the 1939 register. This is available online. You can't view the originals, but they're amazing. They're essentially a census, but it was taken in September 1939, the first month of the Second World War, and it was a register taken to produce ID cards and ration books. So it was a good census of the population who had to get registered for their ration books and whatnot. And also, it was before a lot of men were conscripted or sent over, so you get a lot of detail about some of the men that later went on to fight in different arenas. But actually, one of the key things I love about the 1939 register is it's not as in depth as a normal census or the earlier census records, but it gives you the name of the person, their marital status, their date of birth, their occupation. But it also sometimes lists their war service. And I find this amazing because actually it gives so much context to 20th century ancestors. And I love it because you get, I've had 19-year-old women who are volunteering for ambulance drivers, or you get obviously air raid wardens, and you get also, and it's brilliant because it's an additional piece of information which is not often noted down in a lot of other records. So that's brilliant. Also, just to remember, some of the records are redacted because they're under the 100 years restriction. So if someone is obviously still alive, then their record is blacked out, unless you specifically request for the information because you know that person has passed away. Which I always find a bit tricky with house histories because it's like, well, I don't know who was there, and unlike family history, if you obviously know who might have been recorded. But and actually, one of the other dangers is that sometimes I found redacted details, they go across where the address is written as well as the person's name. So sometimes you might struggle to find the address you're looking for because actually that line has been redacted. But it's all fun and games, lots of fun researching. One of the other 20th century records is Electoral Registers. These are increasingly becoming available online, so you can search a lot of these. Obviously, remembering that earlier in our history, not everyone was eligible to vote. So obviously, prior to 1928, you won't find all women recorded unless they had a certain value of property. And equally, before 1918, not all men were recorded because they might not be eligible to vote, because it was based on the value of ownership of property prior to that time. But it still provides a lot of information. And some of the earlier electoral registers actually sometimes record the owner of the house and actually where they were living, because it was probably not the house you're researching. And then it provides who was occupying the house. So you can actually get some details that way as well. Then there's directories, which are essentially like a phone book, but although I get to the point now that phone books are now defunct, so it doesn't it doesn't apply either. But you get the point. It's basically a list of people, but instead of phone number, it's their address. And the 20th century ones are quite good. Obviously, if you're in a larger city or town, they're quite often categorized by street. But if you're in a more rural location, you might still find just the village and then a list of names. And actually, the directories are good also because they give you a little potted history of the village or the town. So that can be also really useful. But not, especially the earlier ones, you can go back from 20th century back into the 19th century and sometimes into the 18th century, depending on where you are. But not everyone was necessarily recorded, especially the earlier ones, where it was a commercial product, so not everyone's going to be listed, and quite often you just got the lord of the manor, the vicar, the other sort of gentry of the town, and then you got the farmers, or other prominent tradespeople. So in a lot of cases you'll find people's names, but sometimes if you find a stumbling block, it might be that the person in your house might just not have been recorded that year. And then census records. Obviously, I've mentioned these a few times, and a lot of you probably come across these already. They cover from 1841 to 1911. A census was produced from 1801, but only personal details were recorded from 1841. And then they got progressively better. So 1841 is not very detailed, but then as each 10-year period went by, they got a little better and a little better. As I say, the most recent released is 1911. The 1921 is due in 2022. So we've still got a little while. We've still got a year and a half to go. But in essence, it's a really valuable tool. One of the key things about census returns is it lists everyone in the house. And I love this because actually a lot of the other records I've just mentioned, like electoral registers or directories, it might only record the head of the house or certainly the adults in the house, but the census will record obviously husband and wife or single person, whatever. It gives their marital status, but then it records the children, it records the servants, it records lodgers, boarders, visitors. So it's really valuable to see exactly who is living in the house. It gives their age, gives their occupation, and yes, the marital status, I think I said. So it's a really valuable tool, and then you can obviously use those details to piece together more of who people were and who they married, and how many children they had and that sort of thing. So they're a vital tool, and some of the online subscription sites like Ancestry or Find My Past, they're getting much better at allowing you to search by address. This was always a challenge. I think early on you could there was only I think 1911 census they put in an address search, but some of the earlier ones you couldn't originally. That they're getting better at that, but equally some census returns actually don't record a proper address on the actual document. So especially some of the smaller villages, so you might actually find an entire village that has the address just with the village name. So you have to sometimes play detective to piece together which house is yours. And so you start looking for things like, okay, there's the pub on the corner, the house is 5 doors down from the pub, so you can kind of use a few tricks to piece together where the house is in that case. And also it's worth noting, if you're looking online, to try and look at the original, because some of quite often the transcriptions get wrong, to put it lightly. I've had a few cases where people have just got completely wrong information, and it sent them on a journey that's completely incorrect. So if you can look at the original, you can make sure that you're actually looking at the right address and the right people. There's another key source. It's called the 1910 Valuation, or the Inland Revenue Valuation Survey. It's essentially, it was introduced for a new tax by David Lloyd George, which didn't end up actually coming in, but the documents it left behind were brilliant for house historians. In essence, it was going to be a new tax based on the value of property, or on property. So they surveyed almost the entire country. Some areas weren't surveyed because they were crown property and different reasons. But in essence, most locations are surveyed, and there's a map, and each property is given a number. That number then correlates to a field book, and the field book gives you the details of the valuation. These are held in the National Archives. Some are getting available online, but they're a bit limited. So in most cases, you still have to go to the National Archives. But the field book provides enormous information. So it will give you the name of the owner and the occupant. It also gives you the type of ownership, so whether it was freehold or leasehold. And actually by that point you still get copyhold, which was an old form of land ownership where it was still attached to the manor, but could be transferred to in a will or by sale. But so yeah, to get complicated, but yes, but it gives you all those details. So in some cases it also gives you when the last lease was signed or when the last sale took place, which is brilliant. But then it gives you a description of the property, so a written description. Sometimes you can even find a plan, which is brilliant. And then of course it gives you the value. It gives you, obviously it was for a tax, so it gives you the valuation of the property. If you can't get access to the National Archives, sometimes the original or not original, but the first valuation books that the valuers wrote up can be held in a local county record office. So there's varying survivals of these, but you can get, they're actually sometimes catalogued as Doomsday Book, but it's 1910 or before the First World War. Sometimes it's 1910 to 14. So you might find those in your local county record office. But that's a really great tool. If you look at the valuation record and then perhaps look at the 1911 census, and you've got this real window into what was happening in the Edwardian period. So it's great, and that can either take you back through to the 19th century through censuses and things, or take you forward into electoral registers and things. So that's really good. There's all sorts. There's land tax. Land tax was, surviving records are largely late 18th century up to 1832. In 1832, they changed the record. They changed the reasons why they were recording land tax. It was actually being used as a register of eligibility to vote, because again, it was based on the value of property. But by that point, they then decided to create poll books and change the way that they didn't record the land tax anymore. You can be really lucky, and they go back earlier. For example, actually, the Bristol house that was just in A House Through Time, the land tax records were vital because they actually went back to the 17th century when the house was built. So it was an extraordinary collection, and actually was brilliant because it gave you all the details about the landowner, and he actually owned a few properties and built a few properties on the street. So, but that was Bristol. But then I found some records where actually you might just get a couple in the 1820s or something. So it just depends. So, but it can be really valuable because it gives you, essentially it gives you who's paying the tax. And the values can also help guide you into tracing the house, but they don't necessarily give you a correct valuation of the house, because the tax was actually a lump sum that was it was ascribed to a area and then a parish and then divided up, but it wasn't actually a valuation of the property. So just to get confusing. Yeah, so now from here you kind of get a whole lot of different sources, and you can go off in different directions, again, depending on your house, the age of the house, and who was living there, what details you found so far. So things like wills and probate records will give you some details about who the owners were, also sometimes who the occupants were. Perhaps it passed down through different family members. And there can be some real gold dust in wills, where it gives you details of family relationships. It was a fantastic story of it was actually an estate where it was in Norwich, and a grandfather actually ended up leaving an extensive property, like very valuable property, with one house and a whole lot of other houses and land, and he gave it to his grandchildren. He actually had quite a few grandchildren, but he gave it to his grandchildren, disinherited his own son, actually left his daughter-in-law a legacy, because it turns out that the son had gone off and had an affair and had an illegitimate child who was living in a village in Suffolk somewhere. And so actually this whole story unraveled. And it was funny because the family had heard this rumor that something wasn't right, but they had no idea about this whole affair, this illegitimate child. And then that led me to the divorce records, which were held in the National Archives, and actually some of them are available on Ancestry. And it actually had all the details about the wife was actually suing the husband for divorce. And it had all the details about the fact that she knew her husband was seeing, I can't remember the woman's name, but another woman in the village of such and such. And on several occasions they were seeing at this hotel, and, also, it all unraveled. So you just don't know what you'll find in a will. There could be all sorts of details. And obviously probate inventories can give you details about the property, give you details about the interiors and some of the valuables. So whether that was, crockery and linen, or musical instruments, or, beds and all sorts, and actually can give you a picture of what the house was like at a certain time. Equally, sales particulars and auction catalogues can help with that. So again, they'll vary. Sometimes you can find really fantastic details, and the house and its contents are described. It could actually give you who the occupant was, what rent they were paying, and how long they've been resident in the house. And it can also provide things like photographs and illustrations, plans of the property. So they can be great, but you might not find sales particulars for every house. So it just depends. Newspapers are another very important source, and these are increasingly getting better at searching online. So much, obviously, through Find My Past or British newspapers online. The original full collections at the British Library, but you can get a lot online. So you can search for people's names, the address, street address, and you can get all sorts of details. You can get details of events that took place. I've researched some houses where actually they were raided by the police because it was thought they were an illegal gambling den, so all sorts. I've had some which actually the house ended up being owned by some gangsters in the 1940s, and they were exposed in the 1950s, and all these details came out in the newspaper articles. But also simple things like perhaps the lady of the house was advertising for a new lady's maid, or maybe it's actually a record of the house for sale, or you get advertisements. So actually it can be fantastic details in old newspapers. There's also things like drainage and building plans. You won't find them for everything, so it just depends. And they tend to only date from the 20th century or late 19th century. They were only required for new properties later in the 19th century. And then, of course, some of them have been thrown out through time and not kept. Obviously, photos and illustrations is a key one. You can search for a whole. There's all sorts of places you can search for photos and illustrations, and it would depend on your area as well. Insurance records, you can find old insurance certificates. There's actually another source in the National Archives called the National Farm Survey, and this was actually produced during the Second World War, from 1941 to 43. And it actually was a survey of farms, and it was to gauge their productivity. Obviously, this is the height of the Second World War, where growing food and all sorts was vital for the war effort. So actually, it's a really nice snapshot if you're in a rural or former farm location. So it gives you obviously details of the occupant and the owner. It gives you a survey of the farm, and it gives you details about what crops they were growing, how many animals they had, what kind of animals. And then actually they graded the farms. And so actually if you're an A farm, then you're doing brilliantly, you're a gold star. But then you get C farms, which are clearly not running efficiently and actually need help. But that's a brilliant source if you're looking at a farmhouse. And then from this point, you start looking at all sorts of things, and you start getting into genealogical sources, because once you've kind of built up a list of all these names, a lot of these sources will give you a list of names, but then in order to actually establish who they were, what they were doing, perhaps their relationships, their families, how long they're in the house, actually build up a story about who people were. Then of course you end up looking at sort of family history records, so obviously parish registers, also things like military records, court records, but you also get things like letters and diaries, passenger lists, immigration records. So, and increasingly a lot of the online subscription sites are getting much better at, not better, but they're increasingly digitizing far more records. So you can find all sorts of different sources. And also there's some of the family history links, actually if someone's done a family tree, although look at some online family trees with a pinch of salt, because I've found quite a few that are not right. But they can still lead you into sources and context and family connections, which you might not get otherwise. So, and actually I found some brilliant photographs that way, because there's people who've posted their family photos and things. So yes, I think I've run through all the sources, but as I said at the beginning, it's a lot of these you might be familiar with, and it is very much piecing together different elements from lots of different sources, and the ones that are relevant for your area or your house or your street might can vary enormously, or the dates available for certain records. So whenever as I say, I'm doing a house in Essex, but I've also started a house in Gloucestershire, and actually completely different records. Obviously they're different houses, but they're very different, and one's a church house, it's a former parsonage, so therefore you've got church records available to you, so there's all that to work through as well, which is great. But yeah, it can vary enormously, but it's all to play for, as they say. But if you piece together all the different elements, and you get details from the directories and the electoral registers, and then you can match that with something else. And again, it's also about, as much as you can, trying to verify different details with different sources. So don't necessarily rely solely on census records, or things which you might need a bit more context with directories, and certainly with the 10-year period between censuses. So yeah, I think I've run through all all the sources. So now available for questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Feel free to unmute yourselves, everyone, and if you'd like to ask a question, then now is your chance. Either type something in the box or ask directly. I think you should be able to unmute yourselves. If you can't, no, some people have, so clearly you can. Sometimes I override things, and then nobody can say anything. So would anyone like to make any comments or ask any questions at this point?
Hi, Melanie. Richard. Is
Hi.
there a way of finding out where old solicitor records are? If they're not in a record office, are they handed down to new solicitors? And can you access what records they have if it's not your house? Because we're doing one place studies, so quite often they're not our houses.
Yeah, in that case, they won't. If you found the right solicitor, they won't release the details unless you've got the permission of the owner, or if you are the owner. So, in that case, I would actually perhaps approach the people living in the house or the owners to say, look, we're doing this research. Would you allow us to request the deed or copies of the deeds? That'd be my first point of call. It is tricky if you've got details of solicitor and then they're no longer in business. It can be tricky because you've got some solicitors who are still in business, but they have long ago got rid of all their old deeds because they didn't have the storage space. So it depends. But in some cases, if the business was bought out by someone else, it can be tricky to trace that, especially if it might have happened several times. Like if you've got a 19th century solicitor, but actually their business was sold on 5 times since then, so it can be a bit tricky. But if you've got, just trying to think, if you've got the land, you can request the title register from Land Registry. It costs about, I think it's £3 or something. And in that case, you don't necessarily need the owner's permission. You can access that directly. You just need to set up an account. As long as you go to the official government website, because there's a few dodgy ones out there, but as long as you go to the .gov.uk, government website, look for Land Registry, Title Register, and all you need is a postcode or address, and then you can request that way. And that might give you a few vital clues that way. Does that help?
Melanie, can I ask a question? Yes, I have tried to go to the land registry that you've just suggested to get some old title deeds back, which I needed, and I've had my money returned on each occasion, which I found rather strange.
Oh, did you request it online?
Yes.
Or because you can actually, was it the full title register or just the abbreviated one, or was it just any?
What I wanted to do was to start from the most recent ones and work my way back so that I could get this continuity. But it just didn't work because they wouldn't supply the title deeds.
Yeah, that's a bit weird. I've never had that, because it should actually just provide you with a link to download a PDF copy of the register.
Strangely enough, I was able to get the one for the people who are actually living in the house now, but I couldn't seem to get them for any further back.
Oh, in that case, it might be that they don't exist further back. As I say, in a lot of cases, they've just got the most recent record or the most recent transfer or purchase. It should, in some cases, give you details about it's an abbreviated version of full title register can be requested. And that sometimes, the last time I did that, I still had to do it in writing and send a check, which I think that was my last check in my checkbook, because I don't, if that happens again, I can't do it. But yeah, you can sometimes request further information, and it might have additional details. But in some other cases, it just only goes back, as I say, you might only have it back to the 1990s or even the last purchase 10 years ago. And sadly, if they didn't record anything prior to that, or if it wasn't registered before that and they don't have details, then you might not find anything. But it's funny that you applied and then got your money returned. I don't know what.
The present owners have got all the details of all the various owners going back to 1910, before that the records were destroyed, which was a bit of a shame, because when I lived there in the 50s, my parents had the title deeds going back to when it was built. But of course, I didn't know I'd be doing a house history then.
That's what, I get so upset when I hear those stories, because you just know that in a lot of cases they've just been tossed. If it's changed hands and then the new owners don't want them, or they go to the solicitor and end up buried in a box somewhere and then get thrown in a skip, or it's a bit disheartening. It's to know that they had the whole collection and it's not there anymore is very disappointing.
Yes, it's infuriating.
I know. Yes, I totally agree.
We're getting some questions in the chat window. So Pam's asking, what's the most interesting property you've researched?
Oh, that's a tough one. It's like saying who's your favorite child. But oh gosh, yeah. It has to be said, the Cotswold one I told you about earlier, which was linked to Elizabeth I. That's definitely one of my favorites, because it was full of stories, as a lot, along with Elizabeth I, and then her doctor, who's Dr. Lopez, who ended up being accused of treason. And it was just an incredible court drama, Elizabethan Tudor court drama, and basically, yeah, it sounds like he was innocent, but he was caught up in the whole espionage, and then this was the period of the Spanish Armada and all that. But then later, 100 years or 200 years later, it ended up being owned by a man called John Wheatcroft, who ended up in France as a very successful merchant. And he was living in Le Havre at the time of the French Revolution, which is exciting enough. But he was actually, Le Havre was able to sort of keep trading quite effectively while all hell was breaking loose in Paris. But it turns out that he became very friendly with Thomas Jefferson, the future president of America. And actually there's letters and diary records of Thomas Jefferson's former personal assistant, and they're all documented, and these letters between the two and the whole story. It's just incredible. And then also he became friendly with Mary Wollstonecraft, who was writing her book on the French Revolution at the time, of course. And John Wheatcroft ended up being a witness to the birth of her first daughter, Fanny Imlay. And there's John Wheatcroft on the birth certificate, or the register of birth. So that house was just brilliant. The owners were just over the moon. It had so many stories. So that's probably up there with one of my best. Yeah.
Sounds fabulous.
Yeah, I know.
Get your teeth
As I said, I was the one in the archives going, oh, yes. So yeah, it was good.
Thanks for that.
What else we got? Sally is saying, where would you look for Victorian churches? Would some of the information be with the parish records? Similarly with schools, so more institutional histories rather than dwelling histories.
Yeah, definitely. The parish registers, the same way that you would look for registers of birth or baptism, the church records that are largely held in the appropriate record office, they hold all sorts of collections. So that could be actually really quite dry records about the cost of repairing the church roof, to actually details about all the former vicars or parsons, details. As I said, actually the one I'm doing at the moment, which is in Gloucestershire, it's a former parsonage, so I'm actually looking at these records at the moment. And it ends up, the house was actually lived in by the curate, and the actual main vicar was in the nearby parish. But there's records and letters that are talking about providing a house for the curate who's needed to give service to the parishes in this other area. So hopefully, I've yet to head to Bristol Archives to get to the diocese records, but they provide hopefully will provide a lot of details. But as I say, each area will have parish if you look in the catalogue, sometimes old school, you had a folder in the archives where it would have the parish records, and you could look up the parish that your house is situated. And along with all the records of marriages and burials and whatnot, it will then have another section which is of church records and details about, running the church building, or details about the actual running of the church and the parish. So yeah, and the same with schools. I think it depends if it was a private school or if it's a later institution. It could be a bit tricky. But
school. It'd be a national school.
A national school. Sorry, I can't see.
No, it did.
Sorry.
Oh,
hi, Sally.
No, it's fine. Yeah, it would be. Did they call them national schools when they started to build schools themselves?
Yeah.
So it would be not so much a school house as such as the educational establishment itself. And similarly, going back to the church, because the church that I'm in, the place that I'm looking at doing, the church is no longer there now. It was there to about 1940, and then it was ripped down and disappeared. So
You should, I mean, the records should still survive in the record office. So it should
Okay.
still, even if it's a now defunct parish. And equally with schools, I think I've never actually done a former school building, but I do know that it just depends. It might be in a private collection or it might have been passed on. But if you go to the county record office, they should have the records for different institutions. And the same would apply for things like asylums and different other sort of institutions that were established, especially in the 19th century, because a lot of them were private and then may have eventually been passed on to council or parish records. So
this is the likes of, say, an isolation hospital.
yeah,
That
exactly.
would be there as well. Okay.
Yeah.
I guess you're going to get more of this as people convert old chapels and old schools into houses. They're going to want to know the history of the building before it was a dwelling. Right, well, I'm working my way down the list here. Jane has said, is it possible to obtain details about compulsory purchase of a property?
I don't know. I've never come across that. My first instinct would be council, because currently that's how it's all run through the council, as far as I'm aware. So I would probably, the same way with more recent planning applications or building regulation records, you quite often have to apply direct to the council or go on to there. So for something like that, my first point of call would be the council. But I've never had to do that, so I'm not sure what might be available or how much detail they provide, and whether it's protected by data protection and things like that. You might come across some challenges there. So I'm not entirely sure, to be honest.
And Lucy would like to ask a question. So, you're unmuted, Lucy. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So I've been doing my research of the Crescent in Taunton, and I actually work in a solicitor's firm, ironically. So do ask for things like conveyances as well, because sometimes there's a conveyance list which will just list, particularly if they're more than 100 years old. You can get a list going backwards, particularly if yours is an older area where you've got it. So on number 1, which I've been studying, I was able to get a whole list of conveyances from the Somerset Heritage Centre. So it's just worth noting that as well.
Yeah, no,
because they are around. But it depends how old your properties are that you're researching. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah.
Because it gave me the names of all of the people where the conveyances had gone from in 1813 all the way through to, you know.
Yeah, and were the originals were in the Somerset Record Office?
Some of them were. Some of them were not. Because when a solicitor's firm is amalgamated, particularly if the records are more than 100 years old, they will often donate the records to the local heritage centres. Because it's past the data protections guidelines of needing to keep them, and sometimes the houses are gone, they've been rebuilt. In my particular case, they're still there.
They're doing the right thing, at least giving it to the heritage centre, so that's good. But and I should point out there's also it's a bit frustrating if you're not in Middlesex or Yorkshire, but there is actually the Middlesex Deeds Register, which is held at the London Metropolitan Archives, it's literally a register of a transfer, a deed, and it could be lots of different things. And the same with Yorkshire and the West Yorkshire, they've got a collection with the Yorkshire Register, Deeds Register. So if the deeds are long gone, you can actually find at least a register and a part copy of the original held in the register there. But if you're not in Yorkshire or Middlesex, it's a bit tricky, unfortunately. But
if you're in Somerset, there are luckily the Pullman, what's known as the Pullman Records, which was a large solicitor's firm.
Good.
They donated literally hundreds and hundreds of boxes, which they're still sorting through to this day. So do consider that as well.
Yeah, definitely. I've had that with Gloucestershire, the same exact thing. I think they had a few solicitors, and even now they've got boxes and boxes of uncatalogued deeds and bundles of deeds, which in a lot of cases I've been given a whole box and like, okay, there you go. You then have to spend like the entire day sorting through these uncatalogued deeds. But you're right, Lucy, they can be tucked away in archives, so it's definitely worth checking. Yeah.
Pam was suggesting for churches to look for the glebe terrier maps, stroke descriptions. That might help.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. There's I found some really good ones with the housage in Hertfordshire, which was again a former parsonage. And they had really lovely surviving terriers going back to the 17th century, actually. So they can be really great, and they give you, the details can be a bit hit and miss, but in a lot of cases they at least give you a brief description and value, and yeah, definitely.
One I was looking at this week, actually, it described everything in terms of all the neighbours, so you didn't just get the description of the church land, but it's on the north, it's bordered by Mr. So-and-so.
Yes, yeah. And actually that's another key tip. If you're struggling to find records for your house, sometimes if you look at the neighbouring ones, you can find deeds or records which actually refer to, it's adjacent to, Mrs. Smith, and it's adjacent to Mr. Jones, and so that can be really helpful.
Especially good when you're doing a one-place study, because you might not necessarily know the people who own the land north, south, east and west. But that's, that was an eye-opener for me.
Yeah.
And of course there's a good internal description of the church as well.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good tip. I've had that with railway property, actually, when different land was being divided up for the railways, and it gave details about where the track was being built through such and such as land, and then it was going to follow on to such and such as land, and then it was going to so that's another idea.
Lovely. Jane's saying that's exactly how her one-place study started. Yeah, I can imagine. Oh dear. Would anyone else like to ask anything or comment on anything, or anything else? Everybody's all stunned into silence. Well, that was absolutely fascinating, Melanie. That's great. I think we all want to, get back at our records now. I just wish there was something for my 17th century house whose records pretty much the deeds don't go back before 1947, annoyingly. But it's
I know some can be brilliant, and some can be
frustrating.
Scraping through a brick wall with a toothbrush,
Can we please thank Melanie in a Zoom appropriate manner, or however you wish to do it, react or clap or put your thumbs up or something.
Nice. I didn't know you could do that. Great. Lovely. You can little hand claps.
You can even change your skin tone, because as I see Jane has done, but the kind of default is a strange sort of yellow colour. You can make it look a bit more realistic.
Oh, brilliant.
Before we go, Steve, do you just want to say a couple of words about next month when you're in the hot seat? You need to unmute yourself first, because we can't hear you. No, that's it. Go ahead.
There you go. That's a couple of words.
Walter's Upton. Yeah. Okay. How about a couple more?
Yeah, we'll go through how the one-place study started, and how it actually didn't make very much progress for quite a long time, and how it's evolving into its current state, from the collation of records to beginning to pull them together and get to know who the people were, and begin to analyse things like agriculture and of course the what shared endeavour being what it is this year, employment in that parish.
Lovely. We're looking forward to that. So that'll be Tuesday again. I'm trying to work out what day it is. Second Tuesday, and it will be an 8:30 start. As far as for those of us in the United Kingdom, and we'll look forward to that. And thank you once again, Melanie. I will stop our recording now.